Hello and welcome to Comedy in a Nutshell. I'm your host Mark Takano, and this is the podcast where I ask comedians to consider all their knowledge and experience and sum up their entire career in, as the title suggests, a nutshell. Because if there's one thing comedians love, it's being forced to simplify years of hard-earned wisdom into a single soundbite. I'm the comedy nerd who's seen more than 1,600 comedians perform live comedy. If you want to know more about my journey in comedy fandom, then you can visit my website, thecomedynerd.com. If you like to hear from comedians as much as I do, then please like, subscribe, rate, review and share the podcast. Thank you. My guest this episode is a TV and radio presenter, an actor and comedian, and one of Wales' best-kept secrets. Smart, funny, erudite and optimistic, it's stand-up comedian Steffan Alun. When you cast your mind back, do you remember comedy as an influence on you, like when you were growing up?
Yeah, definitely. My brother and I were absolutely obsessed with comedy growing up. I am a Welsh speaker, so all the telly we were watching growing up, most of the TV we watched was in Welsh. And we were always drawn to comedy, to sitcoms, to... there was a show called Noson Lawen, which was like a variety show, which these days has a reputation for being a bit old-fashioned, but when it's all you've got, we were so excited. And also, good comics would go on it because it was the only show like it. So,
right.
Yeah, my brother and I would sort of learn the routines and do them at each other and dress up and perform. And yeah, we like both my parents are funny in different ways. My mother loves gags and puns. My dad was a big storyteller. So I think comedy was a huge part of the mechanics of our household.
Right. Do you remember any sort of early specific influences on you?
I mean, very early on, it would have been people like there's a comic called Ivan Griffith who did characters and did voices, and so I think when you're a child, that really speaks to you, doesn't it? And this would have been sort of late 80s, early 90s, and you know, it was the simplicity of the costume in a lot of the time, where he'd put on a coat and hold a specific carrier bag, and immediately you've got a sense of who this character is.
Right.
And so it inspires you at home to go, oh, okay, what can I grab that makes me a completely different person? Okay, I'm going to grab my grandmother's hat and whatever. Carol Parry Jones is huge. So Carol Parry Jones is interesting in that she's predominantly a singer. And when S4C gave her own show, she was like, well, a show that is only music, you know, I think it'd be nice to break it up with some comedy sketches. And so she's ended up being this actually very influential and very, very funny comedy performer. And so she was huge for me. She would make, you know, she ended up making comedy movies.
Yeah.
She was a regular in the biggest sitcom of my youth, and continues to do sketches even to this day. Occasionally there'll be a new sketch show that she's done. So I think she was a huge influence without me even realizing it, because often she would write for things. I didn't know that it was her. I just thought, oh, this is yet another hilarious thing. So I think often people working in Welsh end up learning how to do an awful lot of different crafts, because it is a small country which is rich in opportunity, because we really love the arts and we love performance. So, you know, someone might win a prize for best novel of the year, and then, you know, jump 10 years, they've also had a successful music career, and they've also like written and acted in a film, and you sort of learn to do everything a little bit.
Yeah.
There was Dewi Puss. Dewi Puss passed away only about a week ago, and it was sort of an honor to be able to pay tribute to him at the Fringe. And, you know, I did a show where there were 3 of the 4 performers were Welsh speakers. And yeah, you know, he was a huge figure in the sort of... There's a lot of crossover between our rock music and our comedy in the 70s.
Right.
Where, like, in the same way, I guess... It's similar to how there's a weird connection between the Beatles and Monty Python, in that, you know, not necessarily in terms of the people in those groups, but like they're kind of looking at each other and going, you know, we are these big defining sort of titans of our genres, and I think that was still happening in Welsh as well. So yeah, there was stuff like that, and then by the time I was a teenager, S4C was already changing a little bit in that S4C was the Welsh language TV channel was created in 1982, and at first it did not have enough programming to fill the entire day. So a lot of shows would just be Channel 4 shows when they'd run out of stuff to put out. But by the mid-2000s, it was like, no, there's a proper industry making telly in Welsh. And what that means is you've got a bit of choice. You don't have to just watch whatever's on in Welsh tonight. You can be like, well, actually, I prefer comedy, so I'll watch the comedy. And at that point, and we're seeing this happen in English as well, right? Because there are so many channels now and so many ways of consuming comedy. You have fewer of these central, everyone has seen it type of things.
Yeah, for sure.
So my favorite sketch show from my teens was a show called Lollipop, which even Welsh speakers have often not heard of it because it was sort of a late night thing, but it was so funny and really dug into observations on specifically Welsh language life and Welsh language communities, and just really, in some ways you might say there was a lot of low hanging fruit because this stuff hadn't been done. Right. So in the same way that alternative comedy in English in the 80s was going, God, no one has asked what the deal is with airline food yet. There's all this stuff. And you can sort of grab all the big obvious stuff. Yeah. And so, Welsh language was still sort of doing that. Yeah. But then the other thing that happened was I caught a moment from a show, and it was a program about Alan Davis. And it was just about his entire career thus far. And this would have been probably 2001, I think. Okay. And although it showed him as Jonathan Creek, and it showed him, it showed a rich variety of all the stuff he's done, but it kept cutting away to him doing stand-up. Yeah. And I'd never seen English language alternative comedy until then. And I couldn't believe it. I was like, what's going on? This is amazing. Because, and the routine he was doing was about laundry, I think. So it was just a very sort of, we would think of it now as like a very normal, if Michael McIntyre did it, you'd think it was old hat. But to be able to talk about laundry and for every sentence to be hilarious, but there wasn't a discernible joke. There wasn't like a setup, there wasn't so this guy goes to do his laundry, right? And blah, blah, blah. There's not a narrative in that way. It's just like bam, 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 observation, 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 funny bit, character, full stuff. Yeah. And he is the character. And I just was unprepared for it because I couldn't understand how he was doing this. I was obsessed with comedy, me and my brother and my friends. All my friends loved jokes. We would tell jokes. We would memorize big, big, long jokes, Shaggy Dog stories. And this guy walks into a pub and three men on a desert island. And so the idea, it was just like, you're doing so many punchlines so fast, the density of it. And then you just have to move on because it's been on television, but there's no way of finding out more information. Before the internet, and maybe we just about had the internet by then, but I would never have thought of it as a resource where you can find out facts. Mm-hmm. So you just go, okay, well, that's the best thing I've ever seen. Now I'll never find that again. But it stuck in my head. So then whenever I saw someone that was doing stand-up, I clocked, oh, this is more of that. Right. And so before leaving school, I'd got into Bill Bailey and Dave Gorman. Mm-hmm. And then I went to university at Aberystwyth University, which had a fortnightly comedy club. And it was just an opener, headliner, and an MC. And most of the people they booked are now either household names or absolute darlings of the scene. They were all incredible. And so suddenly I was getting loads more data. I still thought what they're doing is incomprehensible to me. I don't understand how you can be that funny that quickly. I assumed it must be that these people were magic. It was years later that I realized that these are learnable skills. And, the reason they're so good is because they are workaholics. But you can be a workaholic as well. Yeah.
Obviously, you've talked a lot about Welsh artists. We know Wales for singing. Is there a tradition of storytelling? Is there a comedic tradition in Welsh?
Yeah, 100%. We've been telling stories for over 1,000 years. The bardic tradition of the oral tradition in Wales is absolutely massive. A lot of our stories survive because despite the relative small size of the country, the stories got told and eventually got written down. You'd have bards in the 6th century walking into a pub and going, I have a story to tell, and everyone would sort of swarm around, and that is how they they get food and lodgings, and
yeah,
that tradition is very, very vibrant and vital part of the Welsh history.
Yeah.
Poetry as well. There would be so the oldest Welsh language poem, I believe, is called a Gododdin, and it is a war poem. It's soldiers went to war and took a poet with them, because I guess in the same way you might have a journalist in a scene of war in the modern day,
right.
you'd have someone whose job it was to tell the story. And though not all of that poem has survived, given that it is 1,400 years old, the fact that we have any of it is incredible. And, it's a much older form of the language. It's Brythoneg, which is the language that, there were sort of two broad families of languages in Britain, or Ynysoedd Brython, as they would have been then, that became Welsh and Cornish and Gaelic and Scots and Pictish and Manx and all the others.
Yeah.
But there is a clear line, and if you are a Welsh speaker, it is not too difficult to learn how to read these old stories. And they're also funny. There's so many things, because it's oral tradition. I look at these stories and go, there are techniques in here that I use as a comic as well. There's some bits that are like, there's a story where Cilwch ag Olwen, there's a story of the hero Cilwch visiting his cousin Arthur, King Arthur, as you'd know him, and it lists all of Arthur's men. Like, there's so many, there's dozens of these men, and it tells you what their superpowers are, and it tells you where they're from.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, that's a memorization trick. That, like, you do that live in a pub and people are like, my God, how can this person remember so many names? And that is why it's good. Whereas when you read it on a page, it just feels like filler. It's not interesting.
So what was it that inspired you to do comedy for yourself?
So I'd loved stand-up for a long time, and then it the other, you need two ingredients, I suppose, right? You need that kindling, and you need the spark. And the spark for most comedians, I suppose, is seeing someone who's not very good at it.
Yeah.
Because it makes you go, oh, okay, if that's the bar. Because that's the truth. When you only see brilliant comedy, you think the bar is so high, you think I could never do that. Like, no one thinks I could be Britney Spears. I could, but if you see, oh, actually, there's a new talent show called Pop Idol, and it's just normal people going and singing, I could do that.
Or not singing, as the case may be.
Well, and how many open micers are not really doing comedy, as we would understand it. But I loved those days. So I started doing open mic in Swansea. I was quite lucky. I still live in Swansea. Stupid place to live as a comic, really, since I have to travel so much. But the scene here was surprisingly vibrant for a small place. And I think I love places that are small but vibrant. And I think that sort of underdog thing. And it was amazing. And you meet everyone really quickly. Yeah. This is about 15 years ago, 13 years ago. And there were maybe 60 comics in Wales, from the most experienced professional to the newest open mic comic. And, it wasn't perfect. I think like many open mic scenes, it sort of suffers from, God, these scenes can become quite difficult quite quickly, because you're grouping lots of people together. Unless someone is sort of doing something to try and avoid this, the speed at which it can become a den of bullying and of resentment and bitterness. And, but as the years go by, I think I just got lucky that there were a lot of very positive people who wanted to build a really vibrant scene, and who started talking to each other, and it became more collaborative. And so when I started, every gig was just, someone's put on a gig, go and do that. Whereas after a few years, promoters would be talking to each other, even promoters of new material nights. And I just never stopped. I did my first gig, and since that day, I've never not been thinking about stand-up comedy.
Yeah.
Writing it, performing it, finding more gigs, just analyzing it, learning the craft. And yeah, I'm very grateful. And the scene in Wales has continued to grow. There's hundreds of acts in Wales now, when we count open mic, and that's been very, very pleasurable. And it is easy if you are in the UK, in a city that is well connected to the rest of the country, to do comedy. It's easy to start. Obviously there are like elements of privilege in that, like, I am able-bodied, I had a job, I was a freelancer, so you can sort of manage your time a bit better than someone working in retail and whatever. So there are obstacles to certain people doing it, but we are quite lucky that accessibility into the industry is better than many other forms of entertainment.
Yeah. So that first gig then that you mentioned, where was it? When was it? How did it go?
It was at the Garage Music Venue on the 8th of March 2011.
Wow.
I was a spreadsheet guy for a long time, so I still got a spreadsheet. I stopped after I hit 1,000 gigs, but my first 1,000 gigs, I could tell you exactly where I was, when I was, what material I did, how much I got paid. Which on this occasion, my first gig, was nothing. Can you believe it? And I practiced and practiced. So it was a gig run by Sarah Bridgman. She's still a comedian who gigs to this day. She's very good. And has given a lot of acts in Wales their first gig, both in terms as a promoter of new act nights, and also she has run courses. And although I've never done her course, clearly it is good, because you sort of you look at, okay, the people who've done the course, did they keep doing it? Because if they did, that's the main thing a course should exist for.
Yeah.
And so I wrote my set, I practiced and practiced and practiced, and I rehearsed it because that's what I was used to. I think as a Welsh speaker, you'd go to the Eisteddfod every year. You'd learn, you learn a piece, whether you're singing or reciting or whatever you're doing, and you rehearse it, and you rehearse it in front of someone who can tell you what you're doing wrong. That was just in the blood, really. So I think I worked probably quite a lot harder at my first ever gig than a lot of new comics do. I made my housemates sit and watch me do my set, and so in a way, by the time I was doing the first gig, it wasn't really the first one in a way because of all those rehearsals, but it went really well. Also, part of being a Welsh speaker in my own community is I have a big social network of people who know me. So I think 25 different people came to watch me at my first gig. And you've been to open mic nights, that means that's most of the audience. So it could not have gone better. Really, really easy. But also, and I'm so grateful for this, Sarah, who ran the gig and emceed it, afterwards did give me notes and was like, you ended on a big story. And just so you know, if you're going to end on a big story, the punchline has to be really good to justify the length of it. And so I think that's good, to have had a really good gig, but also to have had something to work on so that you don't walk away thinking, I'm brilliant, I don't need to work at this. And you meet people and they tell you, what other gigs there are. And, and so you start your spreadsheet and you start setting yourself a challenge. And I think that first year I did 18 gigs, which in Wales is pretty impressive at that time. Doing 18 gigs was quite hard. But then the following year I did 61. I think the following year I did over 120. That was my goal, was to always increase how many gigs I'm doing. Because this is a mantra I say to myself sometimes. Even when I'm doing admin today, sometimes I sit down and say to myself, I am a comedian and comedians gig. And that's me telling myself right, you do actually have to go out and do it. You have to find gigs. And because sometimes, you'll get an offer for a gig and you're like, that's not much money to go all the way to Liverpool or whatever. But that is not the attitude. That is not how you get good at this.
Well, it's interesting that the point that you say about you sit yourself down and say, I'm a comedian, comedian's gig. I mean, at what point did you decide that you were a comedian? What point did you call yourself a comedian?
Yeah, that's a good question. I probably would have avoided the label for a long time, because part of being on an open mic scene is there was an awful lot of bitching and sniping. And so I think there was a sense where, if anyone put themselves on a pedestal, they were now a worthy target for ridicule and mocking. And so you'd usually keep your aspirations to yourself, because you'd see that the moment someone said something even slightly aspirational on Facebook, people would pile on them and be like, oh my God, have you seen what he said? Oh my God, he thinks he's a comedian. He's only done 4 gigs and he thinks he's a comedian. And I hate that. I really, really hate it. I think you are a comedian if you are engaged in the act of doing comedy. If you've done a single open mic night and you want to say you're a comedian, I mean, it's we don't tell poets they can't call themselves poets because they've never read their stuff out loud. If you're engaged in the act of producing it, I just don't care. I think that is a level of gatekeeping that serves only one purpose, which is to make other comedians feel better about themselves.
I might have said this to you in Edinburgh. I can't remember. I said it to somebody, but I always I compare it to something my driving instructor told me, of all people, which was that once I passed my test, he said, "Okay, well now that doesn't mean that you can drive. That just means that you've proven and it's been agreed that you now know how to learn to drive. So now you have to do it." to get good at it.
Yes.
So if you could do the open mic nights, that doesn't make you a comedian. That means that you are in a position now that you are able to learn. The more that you do, you will learn and get good, kind of thing.
I suppose what I think is that this is not this isn't a conversation about taxonomy. It's a conversation about language, and we use language that is useful, right? And if it's not useful, we stop using it, and if it is useful, it sticks around.
Yeah,
and we know this because we live in a world where one of the biggest issues at the time of the day is people complaining about trans people using language that other people would rather not bother to learn.
Yeah,
but the fact is, people have now been using they, them pronoun for non-binary people for an incredibly long time because it's useful. That's the truth. It's because it's useful. And that is true of everything. I'm using an evocative example because it feels very of the now, but it's also true of the word comedian. If you say, oh, John's a comedian, then what is that sentence doing? What are we meant to understand from that sentence? And it depends on context.
Yeah.
Sometimes it means this is a person who has a show we can go and see at the local arena. And sometimes it means, oh, this friend of mine has this hobby that's really interesting. And you usually know from context. So I think the idea, there's no point in policing language. Language will evolve and it will be used as it is. And when it's useful, it's useful.
Yeah.
That said, I take your point that probably you're not talking about language. I think you're talking about identity. You're talking about at what point do I decide that I am a comedian?
Yes, indeed.
The proper noun. And
at what point do you put that on the form?
Yeah,
where it says occupation.
Yes, that is a good question. I could check my tax returns and work out when I started doing that. But it varies, doesn't it? I mean, I think there's also certain pressures to identify as a comedian when you are a comedian, because being booked by a promoter is a case of being considered good enough for the gig, but often the promoter has actually never seen you gig. So you send a clip and the clip is good, but maybe that's the only good gig you've ever done. So there's all this other stuff that people are trying to figure out whether you're good or not. So you're trying to avoid rookie mistakes that make you look like you're not very good at it. And you're trying to work out what do pros do. Who said this? A friend of mine once said that there was a big change in the way comedians talked in the mid 2010s. Before that, it was sort of there wasn't really an agreed way that everyone spoke. Whereas now, even open mic comics often speak there's this understood way that comedians talk when they're not being funny, like when they're on a podcast like this. And the logic was this. It's because in 2012, I want to say, the comedian Stuart Goldsmith started a podcast interviewing professional comics.
Yes.
And what that meant was all open mic comics would listen to that podcast. And so you've heard dozens and dozens of pro comics talking, and that language gets under your skin, it gets into your mind. And so you start talking that way. So it sort of professionalizes the way comics talk a little bit, that even someone who's only done 6 gigs is talking with this kind of assumed authority and knowledge, which is not necessarily just an affectation. They do have that knowledge because they've essentially, what do you call it when someone spends hours and hours and hours and hours and hours listening to tape recordings of information about your industry? You would call that training. And I think you can get trained as a comic much faster now than you used to be able to. So let's stop avoiding the question. I think I started being comfortable calling myself a comedian when it was the only thing I was doing, which was January 2015. Being a freelance translator as I was, that there's always a backup if you have a month where there's not enough gigs. But my New Year's resolution in 2015 was, I'm going to try and make every penny I make from comedy. And translation is a break glass in case of emergency fallback. I'm not saying I'll never do it. And in fact, even to this day, I still do a certain amount of translation in order to keep the skill alive, because it's a skill that I value, and you want an exit strategy, because what if you get fed up of traveling? I always remember Bethany Black, brilliant comic from up north. Broke her leg doing roller derby one year, and for 6 months it meant she couldn't gig. And that panicked me. And I thought, oh, okay,
Yeah.
I need to have something else I can do just in case. And so in lockdown, I went back to translation.
Right.
But other than that, I've been, and, you know, I did Zoom gigs as well. And, you know, you do all the things that you do.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think as of 2015, that is the statement. That is, this is what I do.
Yeah.
And every year I've made more money from it and I get better at it and I become more of an authority on it. 2016 was my first solo show in Edinburgh, though, as you know, all my solo shows, all 7 of my solo shows in Edinburgh have been 45 minutes. And so I technically have never done Edinburgh by the definition of the, of the awards panel.
Yeah.
But obviously every year is a year that you're learning more and more. So yeah, so probably every year I become increasingly comfortable saying I'm a comedian. And today, of course I'm a comedian. It's basically all I do. I spend more time engaged with comedy than I ever did in my day job.
Yeah.
So it is an identity. And you know, I think a lot about identity. I'm Welsh and that's incredibly important to me. I'm bisexual. That's very important to me. And, you know, I do lots of advocacy work and sort of, I'm often a pundit on things, you know, whenever there's like a big queer event and they need someone that they know can talk about that in a way that won't scare a certain fraction of the audience. You get a comedian to do it. But comedian is up there. Comedian is an important like identifier of mine as well, I think.
Yeah.
If I wasn't a comedian, it would change the way I see myself.
Let me ask you about lockdown there. Obviously, you'd been going for quite a while when that started. And to lose gigs, you said about, you know, you did some Zoom gigs. Now, were you reinvigorated when you were coming out of lockdown to redo comedy, or did it yes, reinvigorated?
Yeah, I think weirdly, lockdown, I think, benefited my career quite a bit in that I think I'm very good at working when there aren't gigs. There is always work that can be done. And I think there are some comics where if they're not at a gig, they find it quite hard to like sit at a computer and write or to rehearse. No one I mean, rehearsal is so important. Choreography is important. You know, it's not just writing a routine. It's going, where will you stand on the stage when you say this?
Yes.
And that doesn't have to be like a fixed place, but because actually part of the joy of stand-up is that the choreography is being semi-improvised because you're bringing a story to life anew for every audience. But you should have an idea of the basics. You should know that, well, I'm probably going to like do something with my arm to sell that bit. And so coming out of lockdown, the weird thing straight after lockdown is the first gigs that came back were the biggest gigs because they have big rooms. So the first gigs I had in the diary were for the Glee Club. So it's like, okay, so I've gone from not doing any gigs at all to gigging in big spaces, in these big clubs. And I was still at the time relatively new to doing full weekends, big clubs. So I just started getting hands-on with it. So me and a friend, the comedian Simon Emanuel, just found a place where we could put on a COVID-safe gig that was smaller than that was like 20 seats. We found this like quite open-air restaurant where we can get 20 people in exactly. That's as many as we can get in. And we just told all our comedian friends, look, if you wanted to come and do 10 minutes, most because I was emceeing my first weekend back, my plan was just to MC it, just to get comfortable MCing again. Because I think that felt harder than doing a set again, because it's so about like talking to people and creating an environment and an atmosphere.
Yeah.
And what we did was we said, we basically did the free fringe model. We said, it's free to come into this because we have no idea how your lockdown has treated you, but you do have to book a free ticket and we will collect donations at the end. And it sold out instantly. And so we immediately had to put on another one because of course it did, because it was one of the first comedy things back.
Yes.
And comedians jumped at the chance. You know, we had, my God, if I told you those lineups, basically the 12 to 14 best and most prolific and most sort of high status comics in Wales came and performed in a little Italian restaurant to 20 people in Swansea. And of course they did, because they needed it as much as I needed it. And it also sort of started something, because suddenly those 20 people are like, start seeing that there's actually a tradition here, that there's, oh, okay, all of these people are Welsh, but they're so different from each other.
Yeah.
You know, Robin Morgan and Priya Hall and Ignacio Lopez and Matt Rees and me, and like, you know, like this is a very, very varied group of people. Sarah Bridgman and Leroy Brito. You know, we're all our style is not super. We are not necessarily people working in the same genre. I think often in London, you know, you become friends with the people who do the same sort of comedy you do. Whereas in Wales, you make friends with the people working as hard as you do, because there aren't enough of us for that to split down by genre. So the most alternative act in Wales and the most sort of mainstream dick joke slinging club comic will be friends. And like, it was nice putting on a night like that and people going, oh, wow, okay, there are genres to comedy and there's all these people. And so it sort of, I think it was part of the inspiration for quite a vibrant, well, let's call it the comedy nerd scene in South Wales. And, you know, Swansea has a lot of like, you know, I think of them as like full-time comedy fans where they will always, you're like, there are certain names that if you see that they've bought a ticket, you think, oh, brilliant, they've chosen me tonight.
Yeah.
Because you know they'll be seeing something.
Yes.
But they might go to Cardiff and watch a famous comic at the arena. The fact that they've come to my gig means they think my gig is of value. That's wonderful. Yeah. And yeah, I think that was a big thing coming out of lockdown, was like suddenly having this like peer support from other comics, having the support of like local comedy fans, and also just having the time and energy to do it. You know, a lot of comics had to get, you know, a job during lockdown that was harder to give up. Whereas because all I was doing was doing freelance work, I could just immediately drop that and be like, I'm ready, book me, I'm here, I'm fighting fit. My plan had been, it's funny you mentioned driving lessons. I was learning to drive when lockdown was called. So, and suddenly I'm not allowed in a car with someone. So that fell by the wayside. And the plan was, well, if I can drive, I can sort of go anywhere. But actually, after lockdown, my career sort of took off and I didn't need to go anywhere. I could pick and choose my gigs enough to be like, well, in that case, I'm only going to gig in places that I can get to by public transport, which are also the most lucrative gigs a lot of the time because, you know, you're in the cities. And because it's all I do, look, if you book me for a gig in Scotland, I can get there. You can book me at 9 a.m. for a gig in York and I can be there in time to open, even without driving. So, yeah, it really lit a fire under me, I think. And I was really excited to upscale, I suppose. I think I think in some ways it made me realize, I think every year I realize that like how ambitious I can be scales up with my ability and of course with your connections and your networks.
Yeah. Well, another point that you raise is that although no stranger to the Fringe, your shows, you've not effectively debuted because you've not done an hour. Is that a conscious avoidance of the industry scene, or you just don't have that kind of story to tell as yet?
Oh, yeah. I mean, all my stories are an hour when they're in every other festival. So it's not that I don't have the story to tell. I have done 7 shows and I think all of them are brilliant. I think all of them have value. I think all of them have something to say. I think all of them are meaningful. Doesn't mean every single person would love every single one of them, but they find their audience. Yeah. I mean, you saw my show, right?
Yes.
You came on a day, I believe, where the show was full, but not over full.
Oh, it was packed. You were using the banquettes behind you to see.
There we go. You came on one of those days. So, so there were 4 days in the entire run where people sat behind the stage in order to fit in.
Yes.
Most days it was full, and people often like sat on the floor or even outside the room and peered in. That's a successful run. Yes. You know, that was that's a 50-seater room, and there were often more than 50 people in it. Don't tell the fire service, but. Obviously, that's the nature of free fringe. You know, obviously, if I was on a model where people paid for tickets in advance, people would be turned away for not having one. But that's a good run, right? Like that. Like if you're filling your room most days in a 50-seater room, I think anyone would say, "Oh, okay, you've done well." So if you then say, "Also, I did that, and I don't have an agent. I haven't got a PR person. I haven't put up a single poster anywhere in this city. My posters are not around. You can't see them. No one knows I'm here, but someone knows I'm here because I'm getting 50 people a day." That is absolutely on purpose. And that might change in the future. It probably will change in the future. But for now, I love it. It works for me.
Yeah.
Because why do they come? Given that there's no posters, given that there's no PR, given that I never send my best jokes to these like lists of best jokes. I never send a press release. I write a press release every year just in case I think actually I would like press attention, and then I never send it. I don't invite reviewers. There are almost no reviews of any of my work. The panel don't come. People don't know I'm here. I remember doing ACMS once and sort of saying the line, "You have no idea what a tightrope I have to walk being this good at comedy, but not wanting anyone to find out." But this is the truth. Word gets out anyway, because the best PR you can do for your show is have a show that's really good. Like, that's it.
Yeah.
And it is amazing how many comedians do not factor that in when they're talking about Edinburgh. They're like, okay, got a budget, I've got to get a PR person, I've got to get, people will say, oh, I've got to get a director. And obviously that is a nod towards a director will probably make your show better. But it's like, you get a director because that's what successful comedians do. You're not getting a director because, like, you haven't worked out what you want that director to do. It's, you have a year, well, you have 11 months to make a show. Yeah. That's actually quite a long time to produce a piece of work. You're never going to write a show that is you're never going to end up with routines that are as bulletproof as the club set that you've had for 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
But you can make a show that is like consistently funny throughout. And, I wrote 3 hours of material towards this year's show, and then you cut 2 hours of it. And then when you're in Edinburgh, you cut another 20 minutes of it. But actually, it's amazing. I only cut one routine from the hour-long version to make it 45. Which was a routine about a child being slapped at a train station, and I was like, "There's actually slightly too many anecdotes of like confrontations with children in this show, so that's probably the one to go." But then what happens is, like the other time that you just save by shortening the routines and by crushing it down and cutting the weakest punchlines, and then you realize, oh, I should just do that anyway, and then it grows back again because you've improvised new lines, and it sort of so it's sort of you prune a bit so that it can grow.
Yeah.
And then so as long as you make a show and as long as you work, this is the thing. Obviously this show that I did this year is better than my first solo show in 2016 because I'm a better craftsman. I'm a better writer. I'm a better performer. I'm a better director and producer because I do those things for myself as well. But that doesn't mean 2016 was bad. That was as good a piece of work as I could do. I have always worked incredibly hard at all of my shows. And so this is partly, people are obsessed with reviewers in Edinburgh. They're so obsessed with like, oh no, someone came to see my show and didn't like it. And I just think, I sympathize, but I can't empathize. Like, I just don't care what a reviewer thinks. A reviewer's not for me. I know that I care about feedback from audiences. I care about feedback from peers. It's not that I don't care about a reviewer's feedback, but a reviewer's feedback is not given in a form that is useful to me. It's like a reviewer's feedback is, should you, readers of The Guardian, go and see this show?
Yeah.
Well, I don't need that. I can't see my own show.
Yeah.
As much as I would love to, to sort of have some sort of time travel-y way to sneak into my own show to see what the experience is like.
Yeah.
But I have done my very, very best to make that as good an experience as possible for the audience. And I know that. I know I've done everything I can. So if someone says, well, I didn't like it, well, fair enough. I've done my end of the bargain.
Yeah.
Like, I'm thrilled that you've come. It's a shame you didn't like it.
Yeah.
But that's not because I failed.
Yeah.
Like, I did my bit. If you didn't like it, it's because what I'm doing is not of value to you. It's, you would bounce off it aesthetically or in terms of its genre. There are definitely people, I feel sometimes that people, I've never felt it in my shows. Maybe I did used to. Sometimes I've been to see comics and in that room, I'm sort of looking around going, ooh, I think this audience isn't really into the genre they've come to see, but they're at the fringe and they think, oh, go on, we better go and see this. Like, if you see a clowning show with an audience that's not really into clowning, like that can be quite a tough hour to spend as an audience member as well.
Yeah. But
part of that is like, your responsibility as a comic is to work out what are the obstacles to people having a nice time and removing those obstacles. The show is the show in Edinburgh. And it's not on the circuit, of course. On the circuit, you can go, oh, these guys aren't really going to go for, like, you know, I don't know, like I will always mention my bisexuality in clubs because I think representation is one of the best things stand-up can do. You know, and not just in terms of identities, but in terms of perspectives. You know, one of the things I loved about Bill Bailey was that even though he's quite a surreal comic in his content, he would sometimes say something and I'd think, oh my God, I've thought that. And it's that contagion. It's going, oh, yeah, you are not an isolated little being. Like, you've just been convinced that you are because the world has become increasingly based on value the benefits from pretending that we are independent individuals and the connection with other people is pointless.
Yeah.
So, like, you know, we know this fact, right, about, like, most drills are only used for about, 17 minutes in their entire lifespan. So not every person should own a drill. There should be, like, a community drill that the entire neighborhood uses when they need it. But drill companies aren't in favor of this radical approach.
Yeah.
And so we are all convinced that we all need to buy this thing that we will barely use, but we will at some point need. And in the same way, I think with what the arts do is they cut against that. They cut against this sort of conservative, reductive, individualistic idea that the perfect person is the person who is the most financially constructive. That if you're doing a job that earns a lot of money, good, you're a good human. And if you are spending that money on products, brilliant, you're a great human. But obviously, I think there is so much value in not that. You know, visiting your grandmother might be the most valuable thing you can do today. And if you have to take some time off work to do it, then that doesn't mean that is of no value. And I think stand-up reminds us of this. And it does it it's in the subtext, usually. Yeah. You know, isn't it brilliant to be in a room full of people laughing?
Yeah.
Because that is a room of strangers when you first enter it. And I mean, when you enter it as an audience member, you enter a room with people you've never met. And the comic's job is to turn you into a gang, into a friend group, into a social construct. Yeah. We are here together. We have the collective power between us. Like, isn't it amazing? Comedians, like, when you meet a comedian who's incredibly selfish, which is a lot of them, that there's this idea that, like, you are a genius and it's the audience's privilege to come and witness your genius. No. A comedy gig is a collaboration between you and an audience because comedy is the atmosphere and the atmosphere is provided by the audience.
Yeah.
You are a conductor.
Yeah.
The audience is the orchestra. I've never said that before, but I think I will again. So when an audience isn't laughing, it's not because they're failing to recognize your genius. It's because you are failing to conduct them, to bring that atmosphere out of them. And easier said than done. Obviously, some audiences are easier to amuse than others.
Yeah.
You know, often if you're doing a gig in a small village that has barely any entertainment, that's quite an easy crowd. Whereas if you're on at 9:30 p.m. in the Banshee Labyrinth Fringe and your audience are predominantly people who've seen 5 other shows that day, it's a little bit trickier, but it's the same thing. We are on the same side here. All of us want to have a nice time.
Yeah.
And my promise to you as the comedian is that I will do everything I can to make you feel safe, to make you feel comfortable, having the nicest possible time.
Yeah.
And I think about that all the time. I think about, like, should I have let people sit on those seats behind me? Maybe I shouldn't have done that because there's a lot of pressure on them. They're fully lit. If you're sitting behind me, the lighting that is lighting me is also lighting them. And that is weird for them. There's a lot of pressure on them, but also might sort of make the rest of the audience feel a bit weird. So would it have been better to deny entry to 8 extra people in order for the people who remain to have a nicer time? So there's, you know, sometimes it's not easy to decide how you guarantee the nicest time for the maximum number of people. But I do think that's the job.
Yeah. Do you still watch comedy for yourself? Are you that audience member? Do you watch it in the same way as you once did?
I don't think you can watch it in the same way because the more you know about it, but that's not just being a comedian. You will find this Like, there's no way you can watch comedy with the naivety of the average audience member, because, and before I say anything, thank you so much for coming to see my show this year. Like, it was genuinely my favorite feeling is when someone I know comes, because when a stranger comes, you have no idea who they are, what their day is like. When a friend comes, you're like, well, I know what, I know that there will have been so much competing for your attention. The fact that you've chosen mine feels incredibly special, feels really nice. But on the other hand, also, I cannot take you into account when I perform this show, because because it does not matter how hard I've worked at the show, how much I believe in it. I know you'll be sitting there going, oh, you've talked about Monopoly. It's a bit hack, isn't it, Steph? Like not maybe not in that an unkind way, but like, but you have seen so much comedy that it's like there's so many of the techniques I am using are necessary techniques to give the audience a good time. But those techniques because you've seen 1,000 comedians do them. So it's always a bit strange when you have that knowledge in your brain. So that's my experience of going to see comedy. I love going to see comedy, but I do not have the voracious appetite I used to have.
Right.
I can't be. If I wasn't a comedian, I who knows, maybe I'd be a spreadsheet guy. And planning out, let's go and see 5 shows a day. I don't know, maybe not. I find I can see maybe 1 or 2 shows at most a day in Edinburgh, which is annoying because the number of shows I would like to have seen is higher than that. And also a lot of the shows I want to see might clash with mine. Tarot clashed with me this year. That was absolutely infuriating. And you might have an opportunity at other festivals, but there's so many ones that get away. There's so many shows that you can't see. But ultimately, you also have to ask yourself, why am I here? Why am I at the Fringe? I'm not. Yes, seeing stuff is an important part of the job, but I am working. This is my trade show, and yes, I'm jealous of my friends who come up and can just see stuff because it's their holiday. But it's not my holiday. Ultimately, they have paid a lot of money to be here, and I am making a lot of money by being here. Although partly because I don't pay for posters and PR, I suppose. But yeah, so I mean, but I love art. I love movies. I love telly. I love music. I love comedy. Of course, I love comedy, and I always will. And so, yes, I will always be someone who watches comedy. You're supposed to, because you need to know the industry you're in. You need to know, it makes you better to notice a technique that someone's using. And that can be something so simple. Sometimes you see someone doing a facial expression and think, oh my God, that's a tool in the toolbox. Right. Okay. I'm going to remember that that's a thing you can do. I rave all the time about the fact that I think Jack Whitehall is a really valuable comic to study for a comic, because there is not a better choreographer in the business. His use of mime in his routines, his use of, Jack Whitehall is not a trendy comedian to love. He is not, like he has, huge mainstream success, but it's very rare to meet a comic who's like, oh, Jack Whitehall's my guy. But there is not a better choreographer. Like you watch how he lifts a routine. And even if you scoff at the writing of the routine and think, I'd never write anything like that, fine, you don't have to. But if you do to your routines what Jack Whitehall has done to his, if you do 5% of what he's done to his, I promise you'll have a better career. You'll make people feel more comfortable. It's communication. The quicker the audience understands what you're saying, the harder they laugh. Yeah. And so if you say in words, I was in the pub, you're asking the audience to imagine the pub. But if you say, I was in the pub, and you mime holding a pint glass and you sort of crouch down as if you're sitting in a seat and you sort of hunch your shoulders, they are now imagining a specific pub. You're helping them. It's just an extra step towards imagining the scene. And the quicker you imagine the scene, the funnier it'll be when something funny happens in that moment. Yeah. So yeah, I think you do have to watch a lot of comedy, but I still love it. I love Mary-Elaine Robertson this year. Oh yeah. My God. Absolutely incredible. And there is no version of me that would not love that show. And I'm so glad I saw it. Spring Days show, which is sort of like less showy than Mary Lane's, but there's more of a purity to it, perhaps in the sense of it being, it's a bit more clubby in the sense of being like gag, 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 but also, wow, like it's just so good. It's just so good. Whether anyone goes away and says, oh, it was also incredibly innovative. Like, I do actually think it had stuff to say about the intersection between religion and disability that I think was phenomenally valuable and really interesting. But even if it didn't, even if it was just the really funny show about, finding oneself in a cult as a kid, like that's still, oh my God, yeah. No. So I get, good comedy excites me like nothing else.
Yeah.
Like everything Alice Fraser does. Or you spend an hour in Phil Ellis's room and just go, yeah, we go. You just know you're gonna have a blast. It's the least stressful show to go into because you're just like, yeah, I'm gonna have a really nice time here. And yeah, of course. Like, I think I was a fan first, and in fact, I think that's who I am. I think that's how I'm built. I think I'm built to love things, and a lot of the best friends I've made in stand-up were people who themselves grew up as big comedy fans. I think I'm drawn to those people. And I remember talking to the comedian Chris Chopping, brilliant comic, based in Wales now, from Bedfordshire originally. But again, a big, he grew up sort of loving Stuart Lee and Richard Herring, and, he got into podcasts early doors. And it's interesting talking to him about like the feeling that when you hear a comedian on a podcast say, no, I never watched comedy, but a friend dared me to do an open mic. And that was my way in. And not to out Chris as agreeing with me on this principle, but I was a bit like, when I hear that, I just think, okay. Like, I just, it's not that I think less of you. I don't know. I just think when you're a fan first, you know how special it is, I think.
Yeah.
You know how valuable it is. I think the reason I work as hard as I do on my shows is because when I'm writing, I imagine the audience who will come to see it. And that is an audience full of people like I am and once was. And that's the person I'm serving. I'm not writing a show because I want to be this, I want to be like cool and famous and rich and held on a pedestal. Although obviously, like, it is really fun to be the center of attention and to be like, I have a story to tell. It's nice when people want to hear it.
Yeah.
I think the artistic drive is always a desire to be understood. And so there's a privilege to that. But the reason I do it is because I loved it so much and it just seemed so compelling to me.
Yeah.
I want to be able to make people feel the way that my favorite comics have made me feel. And I also want people to be able to feel, and that's like first, right? It's like, I want someone who's completely different to me, someone a different age, a different gender, a different nationality, to still enjoy my work and go, okay, this weird bisexual Welsh boy is pretty funny. I liked his joke about giant robots or whatever. But there's like a subset of that, which is also, I want to reach the people who are like me and would have benefited. When I was a kid, when I was in my teens, I was in bed pretending to sleep while secretly reading a book, probably. And my mother burst into the room and was like, you've got to get up. And she never did that. It was a school night. And she said, you've got to come and listen to this, because she was listening to Radio 4 and there was a Welsh comedian on there. And that, what do you mean there's a Welsh comedian? Who? One of the ones we know, presumably. No, I don't know who this guy is, but he's talking about learning Welsh and he's got a routine about it. And it was Rod Gilbert.
Right.
And that's what it's like. My mother would always listen to comedy on Radio 4. But when Rod Gilbert turned up, she was like, I have to wake up my children and say, look what's happening. Yeah. Because you want to be understood. You want the world to understand your value. Yeah. And so sometimes the job of a comedian is to represent your value to people that you can't do it to. If you're like an introverted, like bisexual man who, you might not even come out. You might not feel the need to. You might not be out to your colleagues. Or if you are out, they don't really understand it and they have questions and you don't know how to answer them, because why should you? You're just a person in the world. Communication and storytelling are skills that some people develop. Not everyone does. Not everyone should have to. But when a comic stands there and goes, this is what it is, it's this.
Yeah.
Like, I think that is of so much value. So, an awful lot of the comics I love the most are themselves queer, or they're Welsh, or they're my age. Sometimes it's that simple. It's this person also grew up with Saved by the Bell, and I like that. Like, just anything that makes you feel a connection. Do you feel that, given that how much comedy you watch?
Yeah.
Do you think, when you think of who your favorite comics are they the people who are most similar to you?
It's interesting because there's three aspects of that. There's the first time I ever saw live comedy, which connected to me in a way that no comedy ever since has, because it was that new instant moment. And obviously since then I've seen loads of live comedy. I will never make that connection because it's never going to be new again. And then there's the people who I would say I arguably have the most affinity with, that I probably should be connecting with the most. But then there's the people who do something that I've never seen before.
Yeah.
That draw me the closest in, because they are the newest thing that I can see now, having seen it so much, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, you're a comedy fan, so you're seeking novelty.
I want to see something I've never seen. I always take that into when I do, because I volunteer at Leicester Comedy Festival. I volunteered this year at Edinburgh. Anyone will take me. I'll help out in whatever way I can. People say, well, when you go to see these shows, what is it you're looking for? What are you interested in? I'll say something I've never seen, or something I have seen done in a way I've never seen it done. So novelty, if you like, but not novelty for novelty's sake. Novelty for the sake of creating a new argument or a new point of view or a new way of explaining something. And one of the things I love about comedy, I get asked about, how comedy has changed over the last 40 odd years. I've seen 1,600 comedians over the last 40 years performing, and they say, well, how has it changed? They say, well, comedy hasn't changed. The rules haven't changed, but the better you know the rules, the more you can dick around with them. Yeah. And also there's people who 10 years ago, 20 years ago, wouldn't have been in a position to perform comedy, wouldn't have been able to. And I'm now getting to hear their perspectives and their opinions that I wouldn't have heard before. And then there's new technology, which means that those messages are communicated in new, novel ways. Social media didn't exist before, and now there's people doing reels. There's Zoom gigs, people performing all over the world. Comedians in America, Australia, I never would have seen before. I can now see, and they have perspectives that I wouldn't have heard. And that is exciting, and it's a way of connecting with the things that I could never have connected with, if you like. It's something I don't understand being communicated to me in a way I can understand it.
I think a big thing at the heart of my show this year is the idea that everything from gossip to multi-billion-dollar movies, they are stories, and they're all told for the same reason, which is that someone wants you to understand something.
Yes.
And I mean, do people want us to understand something from Iron Man 2? I mean, obviously, it can be diluted, but at some point, even the most joyless and facile movie, there is a writer working on that who's like, I want to tell a story, even if their heart isn't in it.
Yeah.
But I suppose what's interesting is going with stand-up, usually the person who wants you to understand the story is physically there in front of you, or in front of the cameras if you're watching a recording. Like, this is the person. Whereas the writer of a movie is usually nowhere to be seen. There are exceptions. And even if they are, even if you're watching a movie where the writer, is like an actor writer, is sort of doing both roles, they will play at most one character, really. And the rest of the cast is filled in by others. So I suppose with stand-up, it's quite a pure form of, I've got a story to tell, and it is only me who will be telling it. And although the atmosphere created is a collaborative act with the audience, the story being told is being told by one person. I think that's what I loved about it. That's what made me fall in love with it. Having grown up on sketch shows, because I love sketch shows as well, I love sitcoms, but I always come back to stand-up because the power of one person up there telling a story. And it's why I lean towards, it's why I mention, I think, people like Mario Lane and Spring Day, Alexander Bennett. Oh my God, I love Alexander Bennett's work. I lean towards comics who strive to present very authentic parts of themselves. there are very, very funny comedians who are sort of playing a sort of clownish, cartoonish version of themselves, which obviously has value, often is incredibly successful, that is less my sort of thing.
Yeah.
Because I think I would much rather, I just always prefer, I just think there's more to learn from that authentic experience. So yeah, I think I really relate to your definition of it. What made me think this was your description of more accessibility of social media, etc. means hearing different perspectives. And I think I also think perspectives is something I crave in stand-up. And I think it can be tricky because I think often we hear the word perspective used as a bit of jargon by a commissioner who's like, who knows that part of their job is making sure they have enough women and people of color in their projects, but they don't really value those things. They like, I have friends, I'm thinking in particular of a friend who sort of had a sitcom that I just don't think had the support it deserved, because she's brilliant. She's a brilliant writer, brilliant performer, and, had this commission. But it was like, once the commission happened, it just did not have the support that it needed to really get the response that I felt it deserved. So I think there's, so I think because that side of it exists, which can feel a bit cynical and a bit shallow. The support can feel a bit shallow.
Yeah.
Here's my my big take, which is, I think, one of the reasons that women and people of color have benefited from a great boost in support in stand-up, and there are other forms of representation that are struggling, is because gender and ethnicity are two things that are visible on a poster. It is much easier to tell whether this comedy night has women on the bill than it is to tell whether it has, I don't know, neurodivergent acts or disabled acts or non-British acts, that looks ethnically diverse, but all of them grew up in Britain. This is a full British lineup, whereas, I don't know. I think that's interesting. That is obviously not me advocate, obviously racial and gender diversity is incredibly important and valuable. But I think there's so my father was an activist. I think a lot of my background comes from thinking of like, what you're doing, is it helpful? I think I am, although my inclinations are extremely progressive, I think I am a pragmatist at heart, and I think actually getting things done that is of value is so much more important than I don't care what your values are if the only way they manifest is that you retweet things sometimes, but and the arts are a hugely important part of advancing progressive changes that need to happen, because I always think about this, it took me a long time to realize that bisexual is what I am. And that's because growing up, you didn't that wasn't an option. You wouldn't present it with it as an option.
Yeah.
The first time I heard the word bisexual was in an episode of Friends, and it is in the context of a joke about how bisexual people are probably kidding themselves. So you only learn of it as a thing that's probably not an option. And there is something so powerful about being a stand-up and going to a town and talking for 20 minutes uninterrupted. And being able to represent and be like, you don't get to just shut me down and go, oh, bisexual. No, I'm going to talk about this for 20 minutes. Okay, you probably talk about other things as well. But you can sort of break it down and you have that power. And as long as it's funny enough, you can say anything. And often the funniest stuff you can say is actually myth busting, essentially. Yeah. And you can go, okay, what do people say about bisexuals? I'll write a joke about each of those things. And there we go. And I always ask, give me a cheer if you're any flavor of LGBTQIA+, is how I put it when I'm in the clubs. And that is a sentence that is doing a lot of things. We're back to value. When did I start calling myself a comedian? When I decided that calling myself a comedian had value and was useful. And so why do I do the whole acronym LGBTQIA+? Because I am a sort of affable, likable, if I was like a Jimmy Carr comic who's sort of very high status, I probably wouldn't use the entire acronym. But because I'm a sort of Russell Howard type, then the idea, the audience want me to like them is my experience of doing comedy, which has massive, massive advantages because it means I can get away with saying things that are arguably quite divisive or controversial, but they'll kind of go with it anyway because they wouldn't take that from from a non-binary person on Twitter, but they'll take it from me because I'm just Steph. I'm just here to have a nice time. I'm having a lovely time in your cricket club. Let me tell you some jokes while I'm here. and so I'll always ask, give me a cheer. And, you ask that in Brighton, obviously pretty much everyone cheers.
Yeah.
But you ask that in a small town, sometimes no one cheers. Or maybe 4 people cheer. And I did a gig once, and I feel like I should not mention where this was, but it was, not a city.
Mm-hmm.
And 4 people cheered, and 2 of those 4 people came to talk to me after the gig. One of them said, but me cheering at that question is how I've come out to my colleagues. I'm here on a work stew, and I wasn't out to them, but it felt right to do. Thank you for giving that opportunity to do that, because you sort of need that. You need someone to sort of cut in and go, "Hey guys, this is an option, and we're doing this. We're going to talk about queerness, and it's a valid thing that you can do and be." And someone else talked to me, and said, I've never said it out loud to anyone before. Me cheering at that is me acknowledging that I'm bisexual and always have been. But it never felt important. It never felt like something I wanted to say out loud. So that wasn't just me, surprising the people I was with a cheer. I sort of surprised myself.
Yeah.
And, I get messages like that all the time from people. I got I've had stories of, family members coming out to each other, and what starts that conversation is seeing me doing stand-up. Isn't that incredible? That that there is this, that coming out is huge. It's such a, it can be, I mean, sometimes it's small for some people. I can't relate, I think for me, it was such a big deal. And you always remember it. You always remember how it happened, and you always remember the good and bad. And it's almost never perfect. And often it's quite thorny and difficult because you probably have internalized feelings of shame that are intersecting with concerns and anxieties of the people you're coming out to. The idea that I did a gig for like 250 quid on a Saturday night in some city, and that as a side effect of that it made that conversation a bit easier for someone, or it meant it could happen a bit sooner, or it meant it could happen with less judgment, is obviously incredible. And I can't remember why we're talking about this. I don't know. I guess your question was, do you still watch comedy? Yeah, you're like, it's hearing a different perspective. Yeah. And I think it is nice to learn from other people's perspectives. There we go. That's my point. I knew I had one. It's that. I know that bisexual people watching my show, Welsh people watching my show, also anyone who speaks English as a second language relates to my work, because it doesn't matter if you're not a Welsh speaker specifically, because I learned English as a second language. I just have a way of looking at that language that's I look at the world a particular way that relates to people. Yeah. But it is not just the job of comedy. It's not just our responsibility as people in the world to engage with entertainment that reflects our own world. It's also to help understand the people in our circle. Yeah. It's, part of your job, if you are a parent, understanding your child is important, is valuable, it is your job. And, the scariest thing in the world is when a parent goes, I'm not going to call you by the right pronouns. I'm not going to call you by the name you've chosen for yourself. I refuse to acknowledge that this thing matters. I just don't think it's a thing. And, maybe you can't talk to those people, but I think a lot of parents are sort of in this in-between state of going, okay, so my daughter's best friend is non-binary, but I don't know what that is, and I'm really scared of saying the wrong thing, and I've heard that people can be really funny about it if you get things wrong. So they're anxious and worried, and they don't know how to get that information. And that's the thing stand-up can do, is it can go, look, I'm going to talk about for 20 minutes, and after that, I'm going to leave this town, and you might never see me again, but for the rest of your lives, you will know how someone like me feels about the world,
Yeah,
and how they see it.
yeah,
So that's it. I think learning other perspectives is really valuable, because that's the job, isn't it? That's our job as humans, I think, is to understand each other.
yeah.
And this is probably the grandest terms in which I have ever talked about my broadly dick joke based club set. But that is what it is. It's you have an opportunity to talk to hundreds of people at a time every night and make them understand the same basic concepts over and over and over. You saw my show in Leicester, which was doing that for self-diagnosis and for neurodivergence, because I perceived that there were two types of comedic take on ADHD, for example, which is either I've got ADHD, I'm going to represent the ADHD experience in my comedy. And on the other hand, there's, everyone's got ADHD these days. And I thought, there must be okay, let's assume that work's been done and that anyone who sees my show has seen both of those takes before. What's next? What do we do with that? Clearly people find the label of ADHD valuable and useful. But on the other hand, what are we to do with the fact that an awful lot of people who very proudly wear this label do so based on a test on the internet?
Yeah.
And, I'm not dismissive of that at all. I think there are people who have neurodivergence who went to the doctors and the doctors did not diagnose them with that thing, because I think, we're all just, even a professional, we're all just guessing, really. And so I think that's what I like in my work, is being like, I want people to think about a big thing in a slightly new way. Like, I don't think I'm the most novel comic in my, although sometimes, I've definitely had like comic shows that ended up having quite big, like, eye-catching gimmicks, but that's always in service of the material. It's always because I thought, right, that gimmick is necessary to make the show work. There's a show where I start by saying there are only two lies in this show.
Yes.
So that feels like a bit of an eye-catching gimmick. But the reason it's there is because the ending doesn't work unless you believe it. Yeah. And for you to believe it, I need to have really foregrounded the way truth works in this show. If I say there are no lies in this show, the show doesn't work either, actually, weirdly. Whereas if you acknowledge two and then when they come up, you point them out, then people believe the rest of it, because they would not believe that there's not a single lie in your show. Yeah. At my fourth show, when it toured, I would take a break to teach people how to do literary analysis. Because what you needed was people to pay attention throughout the show to what topics you were bringing up. And if they didn't do that, the ending didn't quite work. So although it had this, so you would look at that show, every time I did a routine, I would write the routine on a Post-it and put it on the wall. So by the end of the show, every routine you've talked about, you've basically put up your set list on the wall.
Yeah.
So there's definitely shows I do which do have like, okay, this is a thing that I haven't seen a show do, but only ever if it helps people understand it better, I think.
Yeah. You've talked a lot about communication as a point of comedy. You've talked a lot about these themes and ideas and all of these different ways of communicating. As you perform in Welsh and in English, do you find that there are cultural or linguistic differences that affect the way you perform comedy to different audiences, depending on where you are?
Yes, they're completely different cultures. They're completely different cultures. You have to, everything's different. This is me debating how to get into this in a way. Basically, there's a risk, as there always is, there's always a risk when you talk about the way you do comedy that you're implying that doing it any other way is wrong. And I don't know how comfortable I am with that implication.
Sure.
I'll just get into it and I'll see how I feel.
Okay.
So, when I was new to doing Welsh language gigs, very quickly I realized I couldn't just translate my stuff. And so instead I wrote completely different sets. My 20 in Welsh is 20 minutes of stuff I have never done in English. And then that just changes when you become a better comic. But even when it changes, if I take the very best routine, if I take like a 10 out of 10 routine from my new show, translate it into Welsh, best case scenario, I have a 7 out of 10 Welsh routine. Although equally, I once had a maybe 7 out of 10 English routine that I did in Welsh and was 10 out of 10 and got me on telly. So like it does happen the other way as well, where it's people's understanding of you and who you are. I think, and I'm sure countless people have talked about this on your podcast before, no doubt, that a lot of comedians are outsiders. Something makes them feel outside of society, and that is the version of themselves they perform. So on stage, the subtext of my work is I'm a Welsh speaker, I am bisexual, so I'm not like you, I'm weird. Let me be your jester. Even though a lot of people in that audience might be queer, might be Welsh, or might speak English as a second language, but the game of it is I am presenting myself in a way that gives me permission to act like a weird outsider.
Yeah.
And in Welsh, it's harder because Welsh is a very close-knit community. We are a very cozy community. We feel that our relationship to celebrity is different. If you are a Welsh speaker, we just think you're part of the gang. Sometimes people will come up to me on the street in Welsh and they'll be like, Steph, how's it going? I've never met them. They just know me from my comedy. They've just seen me on TV. That doesn't quite happen in English. Obviously, people do go up to celebrities in English, but there's like a sense of, there's like a, ooh, my heart's going, oh my God, this is someone I admire. There's a sense of like, this person's on a pedestal to me. I'm really nervous about saying hi to them. Whereas in Welsh, that doesn't happen really. It's people are like, oh, Steph, because they like you're an old friend. And I've sometimes done that because obviously you meet so many people when you're a comic that sometimes someone says hi to you really warmly and you think, oh God, this is someone I've met and I've forgotten. Oh no, just go with it. But when someone speaks to me in Welsh, I have to be careful because if I just go with it, you can set the wrong boundaries because just because the culture's different, boundaries are just as important, This is me debating whether or not to. Yeah, okay, I'm going to say it. Even in Welsh, you don't want to be baby reindeered. But that means that presenting yourself as an outsider is kind of impossible in Welsh. And there are massive negatives to that. There are positives as well, of course, which is like, as long as you speak Welsh, this community will accept you. You are a member of our community for sure. But the downside is that things that make you weird can be harder to assimilate into the culture. Queerness can be hard in Welsh, I think.
Right.
And there's been issues with race. Like I think we've been very, very bad on race for a long time. It's getting better, but like because we are a small country, I think there's like an older generation that sort of thinks that like a black person speaking Welsh is strikes them as strange in a way that, well, it really shouldn't be because it is a growing language. It's taught in schools and it is taught in schools in cities with racial diversity. Like there are many non-white Welsh speakers. And like our job is to make sure that there is space for them to feel welcome and to be their most vibrant and obvious selves. And that is so true of queerness as well. So it's a bit tricky. It's a bit weird. Like, the most successful comics in Welsh are Tudur Owen and Ellis James, and and that is because, no offense to they are wonderful, incredible comedians, absolutely some of the best in the business, but also they are like nothing about them makes them strange to a Welsh speaking audience. Like, right, they're not queer. Then like, or at least they don't present as such if they are, not for me to presume. They are not, like they love their Welsh language communities. They found their place in it really, really safely, really comfortably, which I didn't necessarily. It's my first language, so most of my friends and family speak it. But that is a bit different from finding your tribe. I don't think I found my tribe in Welsh. I think I found my tribe in comedy, and I found it in nerd spaces. That a lot of the first friends I made were fans of the Pokemon series or Doctor Who fans, and that one of the joys of comedy is to spend it with comedy fans. I love meeting comedy fans because they love comedy in the way that I do, which not every comedian does. Have you been to the Machynlleth and Aberystwyth festivals at all?
I have not. No.
Do you know that you must?
I am aware. The issue it's not an issue. I mean, I do want to go to all of these festivals, but the question is, because I live in London, a lot of the shows that are on, I will have seen or will be able to see without traveling hundreds of miles and paying for hotels. I can go and see them on the tube.
Yeah, that's a good
point. But then there are other shows there that won't have performed in London, but it's a cost balance thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's an interesting point, of course, because it's sort of fun. I now remember, of course, that the main reason you'd come to a comedy festival is to see as much comedy as possible. Whereas the thing I love about those festivals is, especially Machynlleth, is a tiny place, and a lot of people will choose to camp so they can stay in the tiny, tiny town. It's 2 streets, and there's a full comedy festival there, and it's that comedians and comedy fans absolutely coexist on top of each other. You watch the queue for the burger van, and it's Stuart Lee, and behind him it's someone wearing a lot of pastels, and then behind that person is Mark Watson. Behind Mark Watson is someone with loads of badges on their bag. It's like we're all sharing the same space. It's a really, really sort of lovely and inclusive space, and it's the first festival I went to, so I was very spoiled. But it's also, making friends with the full-time comedy fans, the ones who go to loads of festivals and know so much. That's what's really special about it. It's the conversations after the shows are finished for the day, and you're sitting around a fire on the site of Wales's historic Owain Glyndŵr uprisings, and talking about Shelf, and God, Amy Gledhill's good, isn't she? It's so exciting because it's the people who sort of love it that much, and that's where I really feel at home, because it's like these people completely accept me with no caveats. There is not a part of me that I have to hide away. And I think it is extremely telling how high a proportion of the comedy fan community are themselves outsiders in some ways. Like, how many trans pride badges do I see on rucksacks next to a Richard Herring badge? And is there an obvious point of crossover there? And the answer is, when you're an outsider, you find your people. And I think a lot of people who felt a bit adrift from the world found their place in comedy, and found it in the stuff that they watched, and then in friendships that they made. I've got a friend, one of my oldest friends. This is so funny to me. All my life, he's been sort of one of my laddier friends. He loves a drink, he loves sport, singing, of course. He's Welsh, he's in a choir, he's in multiple choirs. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, he came to Machynlleth Comedy Festival. And he has always loved stand-up, but he'll go and watch Frankie Boyle and Sarah Millican, big theatre tours. And then he will see my show once a year, and that is the smallest comedy show he will see by miles. and then all of a sudden he's in Machynlleth. I was like, I was so curious. And it is because he really got into Mike Bubbins' podcast, the sports link being his way in.
Yeah.
But he ends up being in this WhatsApp group of fans of the podcast. Yeah. And of course, they love all sorts of comedy. So suddenly it's fascinating to me that, that even someone of my age can sort of discover a comedy community. And, he's married with 2 children and still has found, actually, this is a space that I find really valuable.
Yeah. Steffan, how can we find out about you and where we can come and see you perform?
Okay, so, well, I do my best to avoid people finding out where I perform. But I'm always at the festivals. Come and see me at Aberystwyth and Machynlleth Comedy Festivals, and at the Edinburgh Fringe, probably every year for the rest of my life. So I do a show called Comedy Translates, and it is so far probably the best thing I've created. And part of the reason it's good is because of the brilliance of the people that I've worked with on doing this. So here's the idea. It is a compilation show where an MC brings on 5 acts to do 10 minutes each. All of them are performing in Welsh. In a perfect world, no one in the audience can speak it. So half the stage is the gig. The other half of the stage is me behind a desk with proper translation equipment. So everyone is handed a headset on their way in, and I am talking into the mic, translating live the gig that they're watching. And there are various ways that this sort of format escalates from one act to the next. So the first thing that happens is the MC will come out, and I'm going to kind of give away the gag of the show here, really, which is that ostensibly I am just a translator. You can ignore me. I am not the show. I am just a facilitator. I am just here to help you discover Welsh language comedy and to see acts you would never be able to see doing the material they're going to do here. Mm-hmm. So you can ignore me. I'm just part of the service. But the gag is that I am a sort of backseat driving control freak who insists on the gig going a particular way. So the first thing that happens is the MC comes out, and I will start basically criticizing the way he's MCing, but in a very good, I do very minimal talking, actually. Like a lot of this is mood rather than content. Like, it is definitely about lifting the other acts up.
Right.
But he might be doing some material, and I might interrupt and go, why not talk to the audience? And that gets a big laugh as he's like, okay, fine, I'll talk to the audience. And then he talks to someone who speaks Welsh, and I'm like, no, you have to talk to someone who can't speak Welsh because I can't translate both of you. And so you sort of see where it's going. The first act, I will always translate straight because I want people to understand what translation looks like, right, first and foremost. So I usually book someone that I think this person will do a solid 10 minutes. I probably know their act reasonably well. So that'll be straightforward. The second act, I usually have a new person come second, someone who I haven't seen before, but I've been told is good. So then it's like, okay, what does it look like when I'm translating something? And I have no idea what the joke's going to be. And then usually for the third act, you want someone who's going to be chaotic and start messing about with the format. Now, the truth is most comedians will mess about with the format when presented with something like this. So over the years, I've had people do sets of puns that only work in Welsh.
Yeah.
I've had people do political stuff that they know I disagree with. So I'm sort of seething as I communicate this to the audience, or it becomes a fight between the facilitator of your set and the words you're doing. I've had people do, pop culture. People love doing pop culture references to stuff every Welsh speaker knows and no one outside of Wales would know. And so the second half of the gig is me sort of storming off in a huff and making the comedians translate each other. So now you don't even have a competent translator. And it is so much fun to do. A friend of mine described it as basically a double act generator, because you put two people on the stage and it sort of is improvised. The set you bring on stage is usually your normal comedy set. So there's an element, that's the prep. That's the only prep. Everything else is the chaos of improv, but within this contained format. And that show sells out so fast at the festivals that it performs at. It's always at Machynlleth and Aberystwyth. And I love it for so many reasons. I love it because lifting these brilliant Welsh language acts and showing them to an audience that would not come across them otherwise. It's amazing. You have an audience of people and you're like, what else are you seeing today? Okay, you're seeing Miles Jupp and Josh Widdicombe and Sarah Pascoe. And you're also seeing the Welsh language up-and-coming comedy scene. That's so good because I love them. They are brilliant. It's such a brilliant scene. And being able to communicate that to people is brilliant. And doing it in a format that people love doing, because you need so many acts to make this show work. The pay for this show is really low. because because also the cost of hiring the equipment means that, by the time, it is not financially worth it to do this show, but everyone wants to do it because it's so fun. And also I think what you see is you get a little window into the fact that all of us know each other and we're all best friends. Because the scene is so small, we can't afford feuds. And so, you'll get, it's just, Mel Owen is an actor doing incredibly well at the minute. And, people would know Mel from other stuff. But when she comes and does my gig and people are like, oh, she and Steph know each other and they have this sibling relationship where they tear each other to shreds. It's just funny, I think there is, like, I love that type of show in English as well, where like best friends put on a show together.
Yeah.
But I love hearing people on the way out saying, I actually learned a weird amount about Welsh from this show because you learn about like the way the grammar works. You learn, through me being furious at someone for doing a one-liner that doesn't work in English, you actually end up learning why it works in Welsh. And so a lot of Welsh learners come to the show. And like it's the perfect show for Welsh learners, I would say. So yeah, if you ever get a chance to see Comedy Translates, and I'm not promoting it because I need to, this always sells out, but I think if you're listening to this podcast, you would enjoy this show. But crucially, find me at Steffan Alun, basically everywhere. Instagram, TikTok. I do have a Facebook group. It's an exciting time to follow me. You should definitely follow me, please do, as I sort of start shifting into, as of this month, I am producing my first YouTube video and making that shift onto social media, which I will be doing as full-heartedly as I work on my shows. They will not simply be reels of me putting people down at gigs, though many of those reels are funny. This is going to be quite an operation, so it's an exciting time to find me online at Steffan Alun, which you can't spell, but I imagine it's in the show notes.
And so my last question, the question I ask all of my guests, in line with the title of the show, how would you sum up comedy in a nutshell?
Comedy is a genre built on the mechanisms that make people feel safe.
Steffan, thank you so much. It's been a genuine pleasure to hear you. Thank you.
It's been wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.